The Roman Empire, once a marvel of marble and law, began to tremble under the reign of a man whose cruelty matched his ambition, Marcus Aurelius Severus Antoninus, better known to history as Emperor Caracalla. His rule was written not in ink, but in blood. Born in 188 AD to Emperor Septimius Severus and Julia Domna, Caracalla inherited not just a crown, but a curse, a hunger for domination that devoured even his own kin. As a child, he was known for his fiery temper, torturing insects and servants alike for amusement. The court whispered that even then, the gods had turned their eyes away. When his father died in 211 AD, Caracalla shared the throne with his brother Geta. The empire briefly hoped for unity between them, but it was a fool's hope. Their rivalry was poison, and the palace walls echoed with venomous hatred. Within months, the brothers refused to eat together, to greet each other, or to sit in the same room. The empire became a chessboard, divided in two, one side bathed in Caracalla's arrogance, the other in Geta's fear. Then came the night of betrayal. In the imperial palace, under the guise of reconciliation, Caracalla invited his brother to meet privately. As Geta entered the chamber, assassins lunged from the shadows. His last words were cries to their mother, Julia Domna, as blood stained her robes. Caracalla emerged from that room smiling. Rome had lost a brother, but gained a tyrant. Geta's name was erased from every inscription, his statues smashed, his memory damned. The Romans called it damnatio memoriae, the death of remembrance. But it was only the beginning. Caracalla's thirst for power became insatiable. He declared himself a living god, the new Alexander the Great, and marched across the empire seeking wars to feed his ego. To the soldiers, he offered gold and citizenship. To the people, he offered taxes and terror. In the streets of Rome, whispers spread that Caracalla had become unhinged. He would appear suddenly in the markets, disguised among the commoners, to overhear their opinions. Anyone who spoke ill of him vanished by morning. His paranoia grew like a plague. He surrounded himself with astrologers, magicians, and priests of dark omens, seeking signs of betrayal even in the stars. He ordered nightly sacrifices to Mars, god of war, demanding rivers of blood to protect his throne. The emperor's favorite pastime became death itself. He often visited the arenas not to watch gladiators, but to order the execution of those accused of treason, many innocent. He would laugh as lions tore through their flesh, muttering that fear was the truest form of loyalty. Yet even that cruelty failed to quench his rage. He began inventing punishments, new ways to make pain an art. Slaves were flayed for spilling his wine, soldiers burned for disobedience, and courtiers tortured for silence. Julia Domna, his mother, once begged him to show mercy. Caracalla replied coldly, "Mercy is for those who fear gods. I am God." He renamed cities after himself and demanded temples to be built in his honor. His image was carved beside Mars and Hercules, as if power could immortalize his sins. Across the empire, governors trembled, for they knew the emperor's wrath traveled faster than his legions. Then came the massacre of Alexandria. When Egyptian citizens mocked Caracalla's arrogance by performing a satire play about him, the emperor's pride erupted into fury. He traveled to the city with false promises of peace. The people gathered to greet him with cheers. Instead, Caracalla's soldiers drew their swords. For days, the streets of Alexandria ran red as thousands were slaughtered, men, women, and even children. Temples burned, bodies piled like offerings to madness. Afterward, Caracalla reportedly walked among the corpses in silence, his armor glistening with blood and sunlight. He told his generals that the gods demanded purification through fire and death. From that day on, the emperor's fascination with destruction deepened. He became obsessed with the idea of divine punishment, a wrathful justice only he could deliver. And in his pursuit of terror, he commissioned his most infamous invention, the Copper Cauldrons. They were massive bronze vessels forged in the imperial foundries, said to be large enough to hold a man upright. The metal gleamed like gold, but carried the heat of hell. At first, the cauldrons were used for ritual offerings, sacrifices of animals to the war gods, but soon they would serve a darker purpose. Caracalla called them the pots of purification. His priests and engineers obeyed without question, unaware of the horror to come. Within those bronze walls, the emperor planned to cleanse his empire of betrayal with fire, steam, and screams. As the furnaces roared in the workshops of Rome, the scent of burning oil filled the air. Citizens whispered of strange noises from the palace, metal clanging, hissing steam, and the laughter of men possessed by cruelty. No one yet knew what the emperor was preparing, but soon the empire would. And when they did, Rome itself would recoil in fear of its own ruler. For in the heart of Caracalla's madness, the cauldrons awaited their victims, boiling vessels of divine vengeance forged not by gods but by the hands of man. And once the first screams began, there would be no silence left in Rome. The year was 215 AD. Rome's skies were stained with smoke, and its people whispered in dread of their emperor's newest decree. Caracalla had returned from his blood-soaked conquest in Egypt, carrying not the spoils of war, but the shadow of something darker. He had seen rebellion rise and burn. He had tasted the thrill of watching a city choke in its own ashes. And now he sought to make that power eternal, to create a punishment that would make even the bravest tremble at his name. In the bowels of the imperial foundries, artisans worked day and night under the command of the emperor's chief engineer, Lucius Priscus. Bronze was melted in huge furnaces, poured into towering molds, and shaped into cauldrons so vast that 10 men could barely move them. Their rims were carved with Latin inscriptions, words of judgment and fear. At Caracalla's order, the cauldrons were mounted on great iron stands. Beneath each stood a pit filled with firewood, pitch, and oil. The emperor called them vessels of the gods, declaring they would be used to purify traitors in the flames of Mars. When the people heard of it, they thought it a jest. Boiling men alive? That was the madness of myth, not Rome. But when the first execution took place, laughter died forever. The victims were soldiers accused of treachery, men who had supposedly plotted against the emperor during the campaign in Alexandria. Their trial was brief, their fate already sealed. As dawn broke, they were dragged into the courtyard of the baths of Caracalla, a place once built for luxury and pleasure. The air shimmered with heat as slaves fed the fires beneath the cauldrons, and thick black smoke coiled into the sky. The emperor stood nearby, draped in his crimson cloak, a golden laurel glinting on his brow. His eyes were cold, devoid of remorse. He raised his hand, and the crowd fell silent. "Let Rome see," he declared, "that betrayal is cleansed not by sword, but by flame." The first prisoner was bound in chains and lifted by ropes above the cauldron. Inside, the water hissed and bubbled, the heat so intense that steam rose like ghostly fingers. The man screamed before he even touched the metal. Caracalla motioned for him to be lowered. Slowly, inch by inch, his feet met the boiling water. The screams turned to shrieks that clawed through the courtyard like tortured wind. Soldiers looked away, but the emperor watched, unblinking, fascinated. When the man's body disappeared beneath the churning bronze surface, Caracalla ordered the next one forward. One by one, the condemned were boiled alive. Some fainted from pain before death claimed them. Others cursed the emperor with their last breath. But all met the same fate, steam rising from their flesh, the scent of burning life drifting through the imperial gardens. Afterward, Caracalla walked between the cauldrons, peering into the water as if seeking visions in the bubbling remains. He murmured to himself that the gods were satisfied, that Rome was purified. But the horror did not end there. The cauldrons became his obsession. Whenever he traveled, he ordered smaller versions to be carried with his army. In Mesopotamia, Armenia, and even Syria, the copper vessels followed like instruments of divine punishment. Captured rebels, spies, and even Roman citizens were thrown into the boiling pots. Sometimes he would command oil or wine to be poured in instead of water, claiming it made the purification stronger. His generals began to fear him. None dared speak against his madness, for they had seen what happened to those who tried. One centurion who pleaded mercy for a young prisoner was dragged to the cauldron himself. Caracalla's voice echoed through the camp. "If mercy makes you weak, let it burn from your bones." The emperor's reputation spread like fire through the empire. Stories of the boiling deaths reached Greece, Africa, and Gaul. Mothers frightened their children with his name. Even priests of the old gods whispered that Caracalla had become possessed by Mars himself, the god of war turned god of torment. In Rome, senators began to meet in secret. They feared the emperor's growing madness, but none had the courage to confront him. His spies were everywhere, and his wrath was unpredictable. One night, during a private feast, Caracalla ordered the cauldrons filled not with water, but with sweet wine. He declared that the scent of boiling grapes reminded him of victory. As the cauldrons boiled, he forced his guests to drink from cups warmed by their heat, laughing that even pleasure must taste of pain. His mother, Julia Domna, could bear it no longer. She begged him to stop the cruelty, to remember his father's wisdom and the mercy of Rome's past emperors. But Caracalla only sneered. "Father ruled with law," he said. "I rule with fear, and fear lasts longer than love." The cauldrons became symbols of his reign, monuments of terror. Artists were forbidden to depict them, yet word of their horror spread through every province. Rebellions died before they began, for people believed capture meant a death too terrible to imagine. In the city of Antioch, where whispers of dissent reached his ears, Caracalla ordered 50 men executed in the cauldrons at once. The heat was so intense that bronze melted from the rims, and the smell carried for miles. That day, one historian wrote, "The emperor has found a new god himself, and he feeds it with flesh. But even gods bleed." Beneath the armor of divine rage, cracks began to show. Caracalla grew paranoid, believing every glance hid betrayal. He forbade anyone from walking behind him and slept surrounded by guards. The very instrument of his terror, the cauldrons, began to haunt him. He claimed to hear the screams of the boiled echoing in his dreams, calling his name, cursing his soul. Some nights he ordered the cauldrons to be cooled and filled with milk, as if cleansing them could erase the memory. Yet he could not stop. His empire was slipping, his sanity unraveling. The copper vessels that had once made him a god now chained him in madness. And as his paranoia grew, so did the number of enemies waiting for their moment. For a ruler who had mastered the art of boiling others alive, Caracalla was blind to how close his own fire had come. The empire that Caracalla once ruled with blood and bronze was crumbling under the weight of his madness. Every city he passed left behind whispers. Every campfire spoke his name with fear. Even the loyal soldiers who had once adored him began to question whether their emperor was mortal or a curse sent by the gods themselves. The copper cauldrons followed him still. They gleamed like molten suns in his traveling camps, carried on wagons by trembling slaves. But where they once inspired obedience, they now inspired dread. The scent of burned flesh clung to the air around Caracalla like an invisible crown. In 217 AD, he led his army east toward Parthia, dreaming of conquest. He sought to rival Alexander the Great, to expand Rome beyond the lands his forefathers had claimed. But unlike Alexander, Caracalla's soldiers marched in silence, their faith burned away by years of cruelty. The boiling pits had consumed not only the emperor's enemies, but also his soul. At night, the emperor's tent was lit by a single flame, and the air shimmered with the heat of his paranoia. He slept little, muttering to the ghosts of those he had condemned. Witnesses claimed he awoke screaming, seeing steam rising from his own skin, hearing the bubbling of the cauldrons even in silence. Caracalla's mother, Julia Domna, had fallen ill back in Antioch, heartbroken by the monster her son had become. When news reached her of his continued brutality, she locked herself away and refused food, saying only, "The gods will boil the blood of my son before he sees peace." Her prophecy would soon come true. During the campaign, Caracalla became increasingly cruel to his own men. He accused officers of conspiracy, stripped them of rank, and had them executed without trial. Even his bodyguard commander, the Praetorian prefect Marcus Apellius Macrinus, began to fear for his life. Macrinus knew what the emperor had done to others, how easily suspicion led to the cauldron. So he began to whisper in secret, planting seeds of rebellion among the legions. He promised them something Caracalla could no longer offer: peace. But fate would move faster than the soldiers. One morning, as Caracalla traveled to the Temple of the Moon near Carrhae to offer sacrifices, he stopped along the roadside to relieve himself. Only a handful of guards stood nearby. Among them was a soldier named Martialis, his face calm, his dagger hidden beneath his cloak. As Caracalla turned his back, Martialis struck. The blade pierced the emperor's ribs, driving through the heart that had long since turned to stone. Caracalla gasped once, stumbled and fell into the dust. Blood poured from his mouth as he looked up at the sky, wide, endless, and silent. The emperor who had boiled thousands was dead in an instant. No divine thunder struck his killer, no army rose to avenge him. His guards fled, fearing the wrath of the gods or perhaps the wrath of Rome itself. When the soldiers found his body, they wrapped it hastily and burned it at the roadside. The flames rose, licking his armor, the metal glowing the same copper hue as his cauldrons. It was said that as his corpse burned, the air filled with a hissing sound like water boiling. The few who witnessed it swore they heard faint screams within the wind. His ashes were taken back to Rome, but his name carried no honor. The Senate cursed his memory. His statues were torn down and his deeds erased from the records. The same fate he had given to his brother now found him, damnatio memoriae. Yet the cauldrons remained. When soldiers searched his camps, they found them, massive bronze pots blackened by years of fire, their interiors scarred by the ghosts of countless victims. Some were still filled with water, others with the remains of bone and ash. No one dared touch them. The cauldrons were buried in secret beneath the ruins of his eastern camp, hidden from the eyes of the world. But their legend spread like wildfire. In taverns and temples, storytellers spoke of the emperor who boiled men alive and was himself swallowed by fire. They said his spirit wandered the deserts, still searching for his lost cauldrons, his hands steaming with guilt. Historians later tried to wash the tale clean, calling it exaggeration, a tale of madness stretched by time. But the evidence of the bronze vessels unearthed centuries later told another story. Their size, their construction, their strange inscriptions, all matched the whispers that had haunted Rome. One inscription carved along the rim of a cauldron was translated by scholars as, "Through fire, the impure are made clean." But beneath that phrase, barely visible, another line had been etched, perhaps by a trembling hand before death. "Through fire, the impure becomes the god." Caracalla had believed the flames would purify his empire. Instead, they consumed him whole. The emperor who claimed to be divine was undone by the same fear he had inflicted upon others, and in the centuries that followed, the copper cauldrons of Caracalla became symbols of one truth, that those who rule by terror always die by it. In Rome's forgotten catacombs, rumors persist that fragments of the cauldrons still exist, green with age yet warm to the touch. Pilgrims and historians alike have claimed to hear faint bubbling sounds near them, like water coming to a slow boil. No one stays near them for long. For even now, 2,000 years later, the echoes of the emperor's fire refuse to fade. The screams of the burned, the hiss of the bronze, the laughter of a mad god, all linger in the shadows of history, waiting for the next ruler to think himself immortal. And when he does, the copper will boil again. Subscribe the channel for more interesting content.